Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello. And welcome to episode 91 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Connections. Connections are so important in our lives. The augmenting of one's social capital. One of the things that I enjoy about this program is making connections, of course. From my sense, among other things, it helps validate the work I do, knowing that there are kindred spirits out there who feel as strongly as I do about these topics. And one of those kindred spirits is my next guest, Tira Hubbard. Tira is a probation and parole program manager out in Medford, Oregon. She also represents the state of Oregon at APPA, the American Probation and Parole Association, and serves on the board of AJFO, the Association for Justice-Involved Females and Organizations. We pack a lot of great content into this interview. I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed recording it. So please, get ready to get your evidence-based practice groove on and enjoy my interview with Tira Hubbard. And I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Tira. Why don't we start out by you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, sort of educationally and professionally, the journey you've been on, your pathway that led you to the position you're in today.
Sure. So my name is Tira Hubbard, and I'm working as a program manager in a community corrections in a medium-sized county in Southern Oregon. How I got here is just a weird path. So I got married very young, and I was a Navy wife for about the first 10 years of my life. And I started doing volunteer work as a victim's advocate all around the United States, working with domestic violence and sexual assault victims. And I did that work for about 13 years. And I got tired of working with victims. And I was tired of working with women. And I decided to go to school and get my bachelor's. So I'm not one of those standard candidates that goes right after high school. Like, I did everything backwards and upside down. And I went and got my bachelor's while working as a victim's advocate with the intention of going to law school. And then realized that was really expensive and decided to fall back on becoming a PO. And have loved this career. And as we'll sort of chat, what we'll realize is that my exhaustion of working with victims and being tired of working with women has come full circle. And so now it's just the perfect marriage of that early sort of nonprofit, grassroots, advocacy work combined with government parole and probation. And now I'm in management. I've worked my way up through the county administration and national connections and things like that. So yeah, that's how I got here.
I love it. I love those untraditional pathways, as you said, or sort of those bundled hybrid approaches to end up where we find ourselves. So trauma has been a hot topic lately in the world of probation, parole, criminal justice. And we often talk about the role of trauma in the trajectories of justice-involved individuals. Give us your definition, Tira, of trauma informed supervision.
Well, given where my sort of professional work as an adult started and working with victims advocacy, I've experienced, trauma when it's raw, when it's with a sexual assault call in the middle of the night as an advocate. And I would go out on a sexual assault call and meet a victim at the hospital for an exam and having to work with law enforcement lineups and things like that to identify perpetrators. So coming into this work from that advocacy background, I think has allowed me to have a unique look at trauma. So where I start with a trauma definition is the difference between informed and responsive. So we've been throwing around for years that we want to be a trauma-informed agency. And there's a lot of trauma-informed trainings. And so the difference is being that informed versus responsive. So one is understanding trauma. What we've learned through all of our trauma trainings and trauma-informed trainings and ACEs and things like that is that people have trauma, right? Like, especially people in community corrections. They've experienced trauma in their life. The difference is how do we then apply that education and knowledge? Do we do anything different with it? Do we ask ACEs questions just to know that someone's experienced trauma? Or do we take that ACEs score and use that to change the way in which we work with people? So I think where it really plays out for me is in the differences between genders. And so when we look at the criminogenic needs of males versus the criminogenic needs of females, this is the biggest question I get asked all the time is like, well, men have trauma. Why isn't it a criminogenic need for men? And I think for men, where we see trauma popping up and that driver of their criminality is in that antisocial patterns, right? Like it's that impulsivity, that risk-taking, that thrill-seeking, that low tolerance for frustration, some of their mental health needs. We see it popping up under those antisocial patterns. But the difference between men and women is that oftentimes men's intimate traumas don't continue into adulthood. But women's often does continue into adulthood. They both may experience child abuse trauma, but it continues for women into adult relationships, domestic violence, sexual assault. And so it's oftentimes more of a driver in their pathway into the system. So anytime I talk about trauma, I want to be really inclusive of all genders, and all people have experienced trauma, and not all trauma is child abuse and sexual abuse and things like that. But how it actually impacts criminality and how often criminal behaviors and substance abuse is really a response to trauma, and the substance abuse is a coping mechanism for the trauma that they're dealing with. And so we spend a lot of time in working with women talking about trauma because it is a big part of their pathway into the criminal justice system. So we need to get responsive to trauma, not just informed about it, but our goal needs to be to learn about it, apply it, understand how it drives criminality for, individuals. Then finally, we really need to be able to look at all the work we're doing through a trauma lens and how trauma plays a part, and then figure out how to stop re-traumatizing people. So trauma-informed is like this really big bucket. And I think sometimes we're just kind of looking at the very top layer of it. So big answer.
Great answer, Tira. Long ago, I had to remind myself that because I get so drawn into these interviews that, hey, Joe, these are being recorded. You don't have to take notes, because I frantically wanted to take notes just then as you were speaking. For our listeners who are likely also compelled to start taking notes, I interviewed Dr. Jared Brown back on episode 69, and he talked all about ACEs. So if you're not aware of ACEs, as Tira was just alluding to, those adverse childhood experiences, go back and listen to episode 69. But I've also talked to Dr. Banta about this notion of trauma maybe being a bit more prominent in the risk needs responsivity framework and not sort of relegated to one of many specific responsivity considerations. And he himself has acknowledged, he just did a talk in Japan. I saw something on his LinkedIn page about almost a reconsideration of the role trauma plays. And he talks about ACEs. My thoughts on trauma and the R&R model reflect the same as you, Tira, that it's not this necessarily strong correlate via the meta-analysis. But when you look at, for example, if you were to do a side-by-side of the ACEs criteria and the central lake criminogenic need, some of them you could just see directly the same: family dysfunction and exposure and experiencing substance abuse. I almost think of trauma as sort of, it can act as a foundation or a precursor to these criminogenic needs. And if that trauma is experienced, it's, trying to choose my words carefully here, more likely, or again, I really think we got to go back and take a deeper dive on re-examining the role of trauma, again, in that risk need responsivity framework.
Well, and we have to remember that at the core, we're serving human beings. And whether those human beings are victims of the clients we're serving, or they're the clients themselves, like at the core of all of this are human beings. And I recall one client I was working with once who was telling me, because as a profession, we used to have much more of a punishment approach. Like we would call it an intervention and to interrupt behavior, but really we were putting people in jail for as long as possible because of contempt of PO and for community safety and all of the things. And I remember early on having a client tell me, there's nothing that you can do to me as a system that hasn't already been done to me by people I trusted. And that was so powerful for me because I didn't know anything about trauma within the system at that point. I hadn't been through a lot of trauma responsive training as a PO. It was all coming from my victims advocacy career. And it's so true. We have to remember that at our core, these are human beings who have made some choices. But why did they make those choices? And why are they going to make that choice again? And if trauma is a part of that, we can't ignore it. POs get so nervous about trauma. Like, we haven't been trained in it. It's not what we covered at the academy. Like, I'm not a mental health therapist. I don't want to ask about it. I'm going to open a can of worms. But the reality is we need to use universal precautions. People have experienced trauma in their life, regardless of what kind. Sometimes it's from their own behaviors. It's the guilt and shame from the things that they've done that has continued to traumatize them, which causes them to keep using, and it keeps the cycle going. And so that's the thing, is we have to remember at the core, there are people behind these cases and behind these crimes who've had very real life experiences.
Yeah, 100%. Here, we talk about desistance a lot on this program, the desistance process. And one thing that pops up consistently in the desistance literature is this idea of resiliency. Share a bit of your views as to building staff resilience, if you would, please, Tira. So
I love that you asked this question after the one about trauma, because we've avoided trauma work for so long as a profession. And now we're really like, we ACEs. And now with this gender responsive stuff and this trauma informed care and person centered. So now we're asking POs and corrections professionals to start taking note of people's trauma. Well, what that does is it creates vicarious trauma. And so I'm the first to say that we did it wrong in our state. Like, we jumped into really tackling gender responsive. We rolled out the women's risk need assessment. We started really trying to do trauma work with women and collaboration with women, asking questions about trauma. And we completely missed vicarious trauma, which, as professionals, we don't like to talk about our trauma necessarily. We like to call it corrections fatigue. It sounds tougher. But the reality is we missed that part. And so we were noticing statewide, we were having this turnover on these caseloads, and people weren't staying on these caseloads very long, and kind of took a step back and looked at it. And that set me on a journey of trying to figure out how to build resilience. So resilience, we can't really bounce back. Like, we lose our bounce in this profession. Like, this profession changes our worldview, no matter how much you try to maintain that work-life balance. Like, I remember when I started, it was leave work at work and home at home, sleep, go to the gym. And it takes so much more than that as we learn more about emotional intelligence and self-awareness. And that, especially during COVID, that work at work and home at home has become so blurred for so many. And so really set onto this path of trying to figure out how to build staff resilience, because we may not bounce back, but we have to be able to return to a place of function after acute trauma, chronic trauma. And that's especially when we look at like patrol officers versus parole officers, right? Like our cop friends are having short periods of acute trauma. We are having the slow boil over our entire career. And we have to keep coming back and working with the same people no matter what's happened. And now we're taking this like really relational approach to working with people, which means like after they've done something really horrific and we have to respond, we may have to continue working with them. And that seeps into who we are. So I've spent the last 2 years during COVID really researching resilience and how to effectively implement that within our profession. And so I did a presentation on it at AJFO and at APPA on the recipe for resilience, because there's no one ingredient to resilience. It's a lot of different ingredients. So I like to think about it as being a toolbox or a recipe, because what we've seen is that through COVID, things that we've always done, some people are like, I go to the gym. That's how I take care of myself. And then the gym shut down. And some people have been like, well, I spend time with my family. Well, then they couldn't be around family. Or I spend time in the outdoors, but then everybody was in the outdoors. So the things that we've known how to take care of ourselves weren't available to us in the same ways. And so we've had to get creative and add more tools to that toolbox. So things like podcasts and yoga and mindfulness and breathing apps and exercise and Zoom cocktail hours with your friends, and really trying to broaden our response to resilience and emotional intelligence, hire for it, support it, train for it, build it. We evaluate on it now. We evaluate on emotional intelligence. We've added it to our annual evaluations. We've made it part of our training program, because it's so important that people be able to know how to build their resilience so that they can survive this career and leave happy and healthy at the end. And this was just not how I came into this profession, right? Like many of us didn't.
Yeah, many of us. Exactly. If you have resources for staff or even directors about following your footsteps as far as building staff resilience, let me know and I can leave links or directions or anything in the episode description of this podcast here for folks that want to continue down that worthwhile rabbit hole. I referenced the responsivity principle earlier in regards to where trauma fits in there, but another one of your specialties is gender responsive practices. I can see the We're in a Training manual behind you there.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about, again, some of your insights with our audience around that topic of gender responsive practices and what some of your work looks like in that regard.
Well, sort of much in the same way that we look at trauma informed versus trauma responsive, I think as a profession, we're figuring that out around gender. And so I want to say it was probably about 6 or 7 years ago, we started in Oregon, we started down the path of gender specific, gender informed. We started trying to figure out how women in the criminal justice system might be different than men. I was raised up through OCMS and then LCMIs and conducting those with women. And gender was a responsivity issue. It's something that you mark on your LCMI checklist, right? And yet women just didn't really seem to connect to that. And a lot of the cognitive behavioral tools we were using, they always seemed to be just a little bit of a one-off. And so we adopted the Women's Risk Need Assessment and rolled that out statewide. What I can say is in doing that is changing gender from a responsivity issue to actually a unique component of the individual women are socialized and raised differently. We have different pathways in life. We have different social expectations, and we do relationships a little differently than males do. And so looking at all of that with a criminal lens, right? Like, how do those socialized differences between men and women impact criminality? So what we did, and this was years ago, is we thought, well, nobody really likes working with women. Nobody liked it. They're exhausting, and they were needy, and they talk so much, and they always bring their kids, and nobody really liked working with women. And so I got voluntold for the gender-specific caseload, which we used to call the women's issues caseload, which just in and of itself is problematic. But so I was like, okay, and we did quilting on that women's issues caseload. And so when I said, I'll take a gender-specific caseload, but I'm not quilting, and we're not calling it women's issues. I'm going to read all the research I can get my hands on. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. We're going to make sure that we are following whatever evidence informs us to do in working with women. So we took 90 women from supervision in our office, and we put them on my caseload. So I had a caseload of 90 women who the only determination to make it to my caseload was that their PO found them exhausting. And I still have all my hair. I'm still here. But what that did was it created a desire and a passion in me to figure out what we needed to do to make the system accessible for their success. Because treating 90 women the same way I would treat 90 men was exhausting. It was impossible. So using the correct, using the women's risk needs assessment, identifying the factors that were really important to them, using cognitive behavioral tools designed for them with their needs in mind, and taking a different relational approach. Office visits went smooth. We started seeing successes. Women stopped absconding. All 90 of them started reporting. And we just had to keep building from there. But the difference for women is that when you try to put them into a system not designed for them, but validated, but just not designed for them, they just don't quite fit. So when we modify the system for them, instead of just dealing with their gender as a responsivity need, we start seeing a lot more successes. No one should ever have a caseload of 90 women. Just, I have to say that. Never.
Well, first off, thank you for clarifying for my listeners who may have been scratching their heads earlier when I made the WIRNA reference. Stands for Women's Risk Need Assessment. You mentioned that within the context of those other traditional risk needs tools. I'm an LSCMI master trainer, and as such, I train that. As you know, it's looked at as a responsivity issue. So let me ask you this. For somebody, again, who's a well-intended R&R champion and they follow the LSCMI, give them a flavor maybe of what the WIRNA might capture that the LSCMI doesn't, or sort of give a real-world illustration of where you see the utility of using that special women's risk need assessment tool.
So the primary difference, with the LSCMI, we've got our 8 criminogenic areas, right? With the WIRNA, we have 13 because, we've got more. Some of the key differences is that the role that relationships play for women. And so when we are looking at their assessment, one, we're looking at abuse and trauma. What role because that plays a significant stepping stone in their pathway into the criminal justice system. So the WIRNA kind of follows along. It's still looking at like some antisocial attitudes. It's still looking at criminal history. It's still looking at education and employment. It's also looking at things like their parental role. So parental stressors and parental involvement. And so looking at strengths versus risk areas. Because what we see often in those we serve in community corrections is that our women oftentimes are the primary parent more often than our men. So that's one of our really key differences with women is they oftentimes have little ones in tow. And so, I mean, that shifts everything, shifts the way we do office visits, shifts what their motivators are. Also, when you can factor in pregnancy and the role that plays in substance use and motivations. With the amount of domestic violence and adult sexual abuse that women are experiencing, that's a difference too, is that many of them are still in relationships that are very unhealthy and are unsafe. So we're also looking at things like housing stability, because women will oftentimes engage in unsafe or criminal behaviors in exchange for housing. And so that's where we see she's staying at an unsafe house with an unsafe guy, but that's the only housing she has. And so housing comes into play. Mental health, mental wellness, mental history, depression, and anxiety come into play more with the WERNA. So we're really looking at women as a little bit more of a holistic and what their drivers are that lead into their criminality. So really kind of looking at that pathway and then figuring out where did things go awry and crime started happening. And it's oftentimes associated with a relationship and some sort of unhealthy relationship.
I love how you use that term pathways. I use it all the time as well when I like to differentiate between, again, criminogenic variables as being those pathways into crime and those desistance factors, those pathways out. But to your point, there are a myriad of pathways into criminality. And when we look at the Central 8, those are the 8 most popular on-ramps, if you will, but they're not universal. And it behooves us to, as you said, take a more holistic approach and a wider lens when we're looking at those pathways in. You also just now responded talking a little bit about different cognitive tools. So same question as my last question, but again, let's say somebody out there is the king or queen of cognitive interventions, but maybe not seeing the subtle differences. So again, with the gender responsive practices, with those cognitive tools, how might that take on a different flavor, if you will?
So, when I first started out, and certainly I'm working with men, was using a lot of carry guide bits, UC curriculum, core correctional practices, well-trained in all of those, big fan, right? They just never quite fit with women. It's like when I would get into some of the tools, and they don't necessarily have a relational component, and they don't appeal to their visual senses. And so we got to participate as a state through Bauman Consulting. They put together, it's called Pathways to Change, and it is a cognitive behavioral curriculum, worksheets, intervention tools that pair with the WERNA. So I really I steal Pathways because it's such a nice visual. But how I always talk about it is I live in the deep, dark forest. I've chosen a career in the deep, dark forest, meaning the criminal justice system. And so I live and breathe here. And people have pathways that bring them to me in the deep, dark forest. And so when we're working with women, what we're really trying to figure out is what stones did they step on or get pushed onto or hook up with somebody who was standing on, but what steps got them here? And then what steps does it take to get them out of here? So it provides this nice visual. So the Pathways to Change interventions and worksheets, they're built on this kind of hiking theory, which fits with my visual really well. So it's what's in her backpack? And so it's a really strength-based, what resources? Self-efficacy is a component for women. If women do not believe that they are capable, they will sabotage, and it will be a constant struggle. I tried to make a treatment appointment, but I couldn't, and my phone wouldn't work. And right. So much like those antisocial patterns for males and needing to teach some problem solving skills, for women, it's similar in that we also have to teach problem solving, but with a self-efficacy component and a belief in oneself. So doing some strength-based like backpack building. What do you have in your backpack that you bring to the table? What can we add to it? And then really looking at relationships. And they're visually appealing to women because the way in which they look, they are a little bit more tangible and approachable. So those are one of our favorites in use with women. And we've just had great success in using them. And we use them both in our institution and in our community corrections. So they translate. If for anybody who's been to prison and then gotten out, we're using the same tools.
I just love your passion and your vision, Tira. Sometimes I think that the good news is we've come a long way since the 1974 "Nothing Worked" proclamation by Bartonson. But on the flip side, I think we sometimes fall into the state of complacency in evidence-based practice world. Like, no, we figured this out. Here's the meta-analysis. Here's the this. Here's the that. But you've done a great job over the last 30 minutes really drilling down a lot of those sort of yeah buts. And to your point, this is people's lives. This isn't, yeah buts as far as a dip in sales or construction cost or whatever. These are people's lives. So we owe it to them to look into, as you've done, those different pathways and what's in their backpacks and sort of individualizing it, maintaining adherence to fidelity, but not at the cost of not being able to see the forest from the trees because we're so blind to it. And we almost get partisan, I think, around evidence-based practices, if that makes sense.
We do. And that's why I like to that marriage of resilience and complacency and trauma, and it all links together. Because I really do see myself as choosing a career in the deep, dark forest, right? And it's my responsibility to light this place up, right? Like, that's what I bring to the table, which is that, yes, this is where I work, and this is how the system is designed, and we have a very heavy job to do, and one that does have liability, one that has safety, one that has victims, and we have to be sensitive to all of those things. But we can't become complacent. And we do become complacent when we are not resilient, because if we're not getting enough light on us in the forest, we get stuck here and it impacts us and we become tired and we cut corners and we say we're doing cognitive behavioral interventions, but we're just kind of checking boxes. And we have to keep bringing passion and energy into this field, and we have to keep it moving forward with fidelity. But we also have to have space for innovation. And I think that's where our future is we shift towards more coaching models and we figure out our identity. I mean, that's the thing too, is we're a profession that we don't really have an identity right now. We've always been, are we law enforcement or are we social workers? And where do we fit? And I always say that we're neither. We're unicorns. Like, some of us were hired as horses, but we have to be unicorns, right? Like, there has to be a magic about us that's not a one-off from another profession, but it is something that is uniquely community correction. It is something that is unique to us and magical about us. And we never need to feel like we're a one-off. We need to just read the research. We need to apply it. And we need to have a uniqueness and an identity as a profession. That's where the enthusiasm and podcasts like yours, I mean, this is why I listen, is because we have to keep listening to each other and building up this energy to keep us innovating.
I could not agree more. And I often tell folks when they'll naturally ask me about my downloads and analytics and blah, blah, blah. And I tell them, honestly, the inner evidence-based practice nerd in me, I just like doing this so I can talk to people like Tira, or, 5 years ago, Dr. Bont is not returning my emails, or I'm not speaking to people literally all over Europe and around the world about evidence-based practices. So I just like it, as you just referenced, to keep me resilient, to keep me fresh. And then whatever my listeners pick up, that's icing on the cake. But I just like doing this because it builds my own human capital, if you will.
Yes. It's why I read research in the bathtub with a glass of wine. Like, I mean, these are, when we stop learning, we stopped innovating. And I think that's a big part of our resilience, is that we have to continue to be lifelong students. We can't stop pushing ourselves to try something new and to branch into that like hot mess caseload of 90. We have to be willing to try new things, but we have to read the research and do it well.
Yeah, correct. Speaking of making connections, some of our listeners are undoubtedly members of APPA, the American Probation and Parole Association, others not. Can you maybe first of all just give a little infomercial for APPA, but then also talk about that organization and what your role with APPA is in your home state of Oregon?
Sure. So I'm the Oregon representative to APPA. So each state or jurisdiction has a representative that represents them on the national level. And so we can make sure that APPA is responsive to the needs of each jurisdiction so that we can say, hey, this is something we're doing in Oregon. And I can speak on behalf of Oregon to others in other states and also to the organization of APPA. APPA has a few different layers to it. One of them is 2 national conferences a year, which are top-notch conferences. One, the workshops are phenomenal. 2, the networking that comes along with the workshops. I mean, that's really the key. It's how I've made connections around the nation. And when I have a question or I'm like, hey, I'm looking for good equity and diversity training, I can throw it into APPA Connect, which is an online connection network where I can say like, hey, I'm from Oregon, but I'm looking for a training. And especially now that so much of what we do can be virtual and we can connect virtually, it allows us to be able to share from others' experiences, fail forward together. Hey, I tried this, it didn't work out well. Here's some research I just read. This is amazing. This is how we're applying it. And we're able to have those broad conversations as a profession on a much smaller scale. And so I'm really excited because as I've presented at APPA a few different times, I have folks from all different states contacting me and saying like, we're interested in rolling out gender responsive. Like, can we chat? And absolutely. So we'll have a Zoom meeting. I'll talk to them about what we did, how we did it. I'll connect with other managers from opposite ends of the state that have done the same thing, how we've worked together as a state. Because to do good work, we really need to be helping our community and our neighbors in other jurisdictions to do good work and to learn from our mistakes. And then I'm also on the board for AJFO, which is the Association for Justice Involved Females in Organizations, which is another national organization. And we do members similar to APPA. We only do one conference every 2 years. And then we're just starting a membership site there as well. And that's specifically for those that are doing justice-involved work with girls and women. And so we run a podcast through there for members called Coffee and Community. And we have online blogs and research articles and things, but just specific to that work with the gender responsive. And then APPA is all things community corrections, parole, and probation. So if you need it, they've got it. I'm really excited to get to be a part of APPA and attend those conferences and network.
Yeah, I could not agree more. APPA is a fantastic resource. I'm going to try to pack in as many links as I can into this episode description. But space permitting, I will leave the link for APPA for folks who might want to check that out. Tira, I can tell we're kindred spirits. I could talk to you all day, which means I'm going to have you back. If you're back on the show in a year or 2 years or 3 years, what's on the horizon? Look in your crystal ball, Tira, and visualize what challenges we're going to knock out here.
Oh my goodness. I was thinking about this and I was like, what is on the horizon? And I think my areas of passion are sort of, and I haven't done much with this yet. I'm kind of sticking my toe in these pools. One of them is regarding connection. And I want more people to be more connected, whether it be through APPA or AJFO or other resources, through social media. I really think that that's a missing piece of our profession. I feel so privileged because of my role with APPA and AJFO to get a sense of the pulse of the nation, where we're headed. I get to kind of adjust my own department too and be like, hey, I think we're kind of about here on this continuum of progression. And so I think really that I'm really passionate about it. I don't know what that looks like yet, but really working to bring counties in the state together, states in the nation together, and get more of us talking and sharing resource. The other area of passion that I've been putting some energy behind is around peer support services. So really incorporating voices of lived experiences within the work that we're doing. So we have in our department, we've partnered with the Pathfinder Network, which delivers peer support services. And so now we have folks working in our office who have previously been on supervision, people that I used to supervise as a PO that now I get to work alongside with as a coworker. And I am so excited about the successes that we're seeing in this partnership that I really need to figure out how to make this a bigger part of the profession for others, because I'm so passionate about it and so excited about it. So I think those are the two really big areas of passion that are going to take some of my time and attention in the years to come.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And kudos to you for recognizing the need for incorporating those with lived experience into the process. I think that's something we're lagging a little bit behind on, but thanks to people like you, Tira, not for long. Tira Hubbard joining us from the great state of Oregon. I cannot thank you enough for all this fantastic information, and I've got my list of homework here as well. You're welcome back on the show at any time, and I look forward to talking to you soon, Tira.
All right. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Bye-bye. For the record, James Bonta has returned every email I've ever sent him. I was caught up in the moment there when I was trying to illustrate the point of how this podcast has afforded me a platform to reach out to folks around the world. But I wanted to set the record straight with that. Big thank you to Tira for sharing her incredible insights with us. As promised, I have left various web links in the description of this episode. Web links to APPA, AFJO, and as many links related to resiliency that I could pack in. Tira was kind enough to forward a PDF document to me with a variety of resilience resources. Space is limited, however, in how much I can pack into that show description. Feel free, however, to reach out to me for more information if you want resources, again, around resiliency. I would also encourage you to connect with Tira Hubbard on LinkedIn if you are a member. She is a true thought leader and trailblazer. Back next week with a fresh episode. Nicole Staley and Sylvester Bartkovsky will be returning to the show, and we are going to be mixing up a cocktail of risk-need responsivity, desistance, and trauma. You will not want to miss our next show. In the meantime, you may contact the program or reach out to me through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practice or program design, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter. The Criminologist Media Group can be followed at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You can also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Hey, merchandise is available. If you want a coffee mug or a pen or a refrigerator magnet, simply reach out to the show for details. And if you believe in what we're doing on the program, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the show, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
So I had a caseload of 90 women who the only determination to make it to my caseload was that their PO found them exhausting. And I still have all my hair. I'm still here.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.